Come stai chiamando? No. Magari andrai a prendere. La moglie è proprio che tuo nome. Ma è no, no, c'è roba sua. Allora dice che poi non
The tank, a game-changing weapon of war, first thundered across the trenches of the Somme in 1916. Since then, the evolution of these armoured beasts has been rapid and revolutionary, especially during the 1940s, when armoured warfare became a dismissed element of conflicts. But what about China's journey with tanks? It wasn't until the 1950s, after enduring internal turmoil and external conflicts, that China finally began crafting its own main battle tanks. Starting from a position of playing catch-up, the Chinese defense industry has been relentless in its pursuit to advance in tank design by any means necessary. In this episode, we turn our focus to China's latest feat in armored warfare, the Type 99 main battle tank. A product of the new millennium, the Type 99 stands as a statement to China's technological lead in this field. But what do we really know about this elusive tank, given that much of the information comes from government sources and is yet to prove itself in combat? How did the Chinese tank development journey shape the Type 99? What does the Type 99 tell us about China's current and future military capabilities? Let's delve into the past, present, and potential future of Chinese armored warfare to unravel the mysteries of the Type 99. But before we dive into the history, let's quickly refresh our understanding of the terminology when we talk about generations of tanks. This expression, used as a means of summarizing levels of technological advancement, is generally used to refer to tank development after the Second World War. The first generation of tanks are those that emerged at the tail end of the war into the 1950s, with heavy armor and gyro-stabilized guns, usually between 105 and 125 millimeters. They became known as main battle tanks. Good examples of a first-generation tank would be the British Centurion, the Russian T-455, the American M48 Patton, and the Chinese Types 59 and 61. The second generation tanks arrived between the 1950s and 80s, depending on the technological skills and resources of different nations. Here, the emphasis was on technological developments rather than necessarily bigger guns or thicker armor. Second-generation tanks were much better able to operate at night with infrared vision and were also designed to operate in nuclear, biological, or chemical war conditions. Examples of second-generation tanks include the British Chieftain, the Swedish Stridsvagn 103, the American M60 Patton, the Soviet T-62, and the Chinese Types 59 and 61. Some tanks had more advanced forms of armor protection, such as cobble armor. As the third generation of tanks emerged in the late 1980s, with advanced features like composite armor and sophisticated fire control systems, it raises a question: how did China, starting without strong industrial capabilities or tank design expertise, progress in this complex field? Where did China's journey in armored vehicle design begin, and how did it evolve over time? Without any serious industrial base and technological knowledge of tank design, Chinese tank development came slowly, piecemeal, and mainly from other countries. In the 1920s, some Chinese warlords bought a few French armored cars. In the 30s, small amounts of light armored vehicles, armored cars, and tankettes, such as the Italian CB-35 and the British Tag Lloyd, from several countries were in the country. This presence came from different military missions, as European countries began to show interest in the political and military situation in China. Advisors from the Soviet Union, Germany, and Italy were there during this time, and Chinese forces fighting the Japanese could point to a curious mix of Soviet, the T-26, German, the Panzer Mark I, and the SKZ-222 armored car, Italian and British armored vehicles in their arsenal. There was no coherent doctrine for the use of these weapons, and they were generally distributed along the front line without any attempt to concentrate forces. Most were destroyed as fighting, but accessing spares, keeping the disparate pieces of equipment serviceable, was another key challenge. In the early 1940s, the Chinese government was able to assemble one mechanized division, the 200th, which had a tank regiment largely equipped with the Soviet T-26 light tanks that were more or less obsolete. The division's record was patchy, defeating the Japanese in at least one major battle, but suffering massive losses in another. There does not appear to be any record of tank versus tank action between the Japanese and Chinese forces, or any evidence that the Chinese had even considered how tank versus tank action might be addressed. After Pearl Harbor, with the arrival of the US into the Pacific theater, the Americans made more concerted efforts to get military hardware to the hard-pressed Chinese forces. Plans to get 600 obsolete American T-60 light tanks to China were abandoned. Even the Chinese recognized that these were inadequate pieces of equipment. Later, the American then peace program was to provide nearly 300 M2, M3, and M5 light tanks, and even 35 M4 Shermans. The 200th Mechanized Division continued to serve in Burma under U.S. General Stilwell, where it won two large battles but was ultimately crushed at the Battle for the Sipor-Magog Highway. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union provided 1,300 T-34-85 tanks for use by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. This was a major increase in capability. The Chinese faction later produced copies of the T-34 and fought battles against American forces during the Korean War. This time there was some tank-on-tank combat. A US study in 1954 calculated that there had been over 100 definite possible tank-against-tank actions. In the mid-1950s, China began designing its own tank. What became known as the Type 59 was heavily influenced by the Soviet T-54-55 series. It was the first tank the Chinese defense industry had ever built and was produced in great numbers, perhaps over 10,000. It was used from the 1950s to the 80s. This was a great leap forward for the Chinese defense industry, and the tank slowly upgraded with domestic improvements and somewhat new technology through years of its operational life. One general and unchangeable strategic problem that China has for its own self-defense is the nature of the terrain in the south of the country. For its time, the T-59 was a heavy tank, and the south was not suitable, while paddy fields, mountains, hills, and rivers were hard to negotiate. In addition, what bridges there were could not bear the weight. A lighter tank, the Type 62, was introduced in 1963. The need for lightness and mobility in a tank was always a feature that was to influence Chinese tank design. As a comparison, the Type 99 tank weighed about 58 tons. The latest versions of the M1 Abrams weighed over 70 tons. In 1969, Soviet and Chinese forces fought a short, sharp border conflict. At one point, there were 1.5 million soldiers from both sides lining the frontier. It was a serious wake-up call for the Chinese people. People's Liberation Army. They realized that Chinese tanks were significantly inferior to a range of modern Soviet tanks of the period, the T-62, 64, and the 72. A captured Soviet T-62 was used as a base to copy from and enhance the T-59. This resulted in the Type 69 and later the Type 79. They were still similar to the Type 59, but they had upgrades from captured or Western technologies. The line was particularly good. There was not the significant increase in capability that had been hoped for. Many were sold overseas instead, including to Iran and Iraq. In their favour, they were cheap, sturdy, and uncomplicated to maintain. But while they might have looked good rolling around the victim game parades, then puffed up local dictator, their actual fighting capability was much open to question. The Chinese defense industry tried again. With a warming in relations between China and the West in the 1980s, China gained access to some Western military technology, particularly from the United Kingdom, which provided an advanced Marconi fire control system and a potent L7 105mm gun. It had received even more modern Western technology incorporated into the Chinese tank design, including an Austrian gun and a German engine. The Type 88 was a useful stopgap. There were more wake-up calls. Chinese tanks exported to the Middle East had been involved in several wars: the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 88, the First Gulf War of 1991, and the Second Gulf War in 2003. Under these testing battlefield conditions, it was demonstrated clearly that Chinese tanks were vastly inferior to pretty much every single Western battlefield. The news on the Soviet side was not much better. China managed to get hold of a T-72, possibly one captured by Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, and covertly handed over to China. The Chinese defense industry was learning that Western tank guns could defeat the T-72, and the T-72 could defeat all Chinese tanks. This was not a good place to be for an aspiring superpower. As a priority, China needed to produce a credible third-generation tank, and ideally also significantly upgrade its second-generation armament for bargain. It seemed that there were two schools of tank design thought within Chinese tank designers at the time.